Hello, I'm David Voorhees, returning for part 2 of our discussion of the red-green axis that threatens America. This series is brought to you by Sharia Crime Stoppers, an LLC that I co-founded with Dick Manasari and Mary Wierbicki several years ago. Sharia Crime Stoppers was founded to bring factual information to the public about the Islamic threat, and in addition to provide training to law enforcement officers about jihadists and the Muslim Brotherhood. To date, we have trained over 1,200 officers throughout the Southeast about this threat. To learn more about Sharia Crime Stoppers, you can access the United West website and log on to our Monday evening interviews with Leo Holman and Sharam Hayden, Claire Lopez, and Christina Douglas Williams. So with that introduction, let's begin tonight's presentation. Recall in part 1, we covered some of the historical sources and personalities that have inspired the insurgency that faces America today. During part 2, we'll take a closer look at the Black Lives Matter movement and Antifa followers, along with members of corporate America who are financing these groups. The Black Lives Matter movement was founded following the death of Trayvon Martin in 2013 and the subsequent acquittal of George Zimmerman by Patrisse Cullors, Opal Tometi, and Alicia Garza, all of whom held positions with the Freedom Road Socialist Organization, a pro-Red China support group, along with Liberation Road. These women are self-admitted social Marxists. The Black Lives Matter movement is heavily funded by a variety of Marxist groups, including George Soros, Open Air Foundation, and the Center for American Progress. The Black Lives Matter movement also has close ideological ties with 1960s group, the Weather Underground. And Susan Rosenberg, seen here at the far left, along with fellow female travelers of the 1960s, 70s. Rosenberg is a board member of Thousand Currents Group that provide financial support to the Black Lives Matter. But don't let this grandmotherly face fool you. She started her terrorist career with the Weather Underground and later turned to bombings of the FBI office on Staten Island, the Navy Yard's Officers Club in Washington, and the U.S. Capitol. She was also a member of the May 19th Communist Organization, M19, which was reportedly the only woman-run terror group in the United States at that time, that later targeted Ronald Reagan's presidential campaign. Rosenberg is not the only former terrorist associated with the Black Lives Matter leadership. Assata Shakur, also known as Joanne Chesmard, inspired the 3 founders of Black Lives Matter movement. She's now a fugitive in Cuba. She's the first female on the FBI's most wanted terrorist list, and by the way, the only non-Muslim on the list. She's a former member of the Black Panther Party and Black Liberation Army in the 1970s. And finally, she was convicted of murdering a New Jersey state trooper, Warner Forrester, in 1973. A leading influence in the Black Lives Matter movement is a so-called white privileged baby boomer, Eric Mann, also known as the grandfather of the Black Lives Matter movement. Mann founded the Los Angeles-based activist training organization, a labor community strategy center where Patrisse Cullors was indoctrinated. In addition to Eric Mann and Joanne Chesmard and Susan Rosenberg, there have been others who have played their parts, who we shouldn't forget, all from the 1960s and 70s. So by way of review, don't forget Herbert Marcuse, Saul Alinsky, Bernadette Dorn, and of course, billionaires. The real point of this slide is to highlight how long the social Marxists, fathered by Gramsci, have been at war against capitalist America. The seeds of this insurgency were planted generations ago, when the long march through the institutions really began. One student of these four is Black Lives Matter activist Shaun King, who promotes the violent nature of the group. He makes Black Lives Matter demands to destroy our institutions, such as Christianity and the church, all by promoting critical race theory, designed to divide our society along racial lines by planting the seeds for white guilt. The Gatestone Institute has been done some studies about this movement, and the leadership has threatened to burn down the system if these demands aren't met. First, destroy the traditional Judeo-Christian nuclear family. And they're well on their way, especially with the Black families, considering that 75% of children are raised without biological father figure in the home. Dismantle and defund local police agencies and correctional institutions. Abolish heteronormativity, the notion that our sexual identity is determined for us at birth, and replace it with transgenderism, or the belief your sexual identity is what you think it is, which could change tomorrow. And finally, do away with capitalism and the patriarchal system. Remember, true Marxists are godless, and they do not believe in a supreme being that created us. Rather, they make the rules. It should be noted that none of these agenda items have anything to do with the death of George Floyd, or anything to do with actually improving the lives of Black Americans. Rather, they are all part of the war on our institutions to destroy America, just like Gramsci dreamed of from within his Italian jail cell in 1926. Let's not forget the connection with Islam either. Usara Kogari is the founder of the Black Liberation Collective of Canada and a follower of the Black Lives Matter movement founders in America. She prayed to Allah to prevent her from killing whites. Unlike Micah Johnson in Dallas, who killed 5 police officers at a Black Lives Matter rally several years ago. With all these deplorable baggages to look at, look who's sponsoring Black Lives Matter. Take a close look at these icons. Just some of the giants of corporate America funding the movement. Do these companies even know who the Black Lives Matter is and what the movement stands for? Or are they fearful of being labeled racist if they don't financially cough up and support the movement? Let's now turn to Antifa. Antifa, the fascist movement that defines fascism as anything or anyone they don't like. It is a coalition of anarchists, communists, socialists, and progressives who oppose anyone with conservative or capitalist values. It has no centralized leadership. Its local followers form autonomous cells that use social media for coordination. Many of us were first introduced to Antifa several years ago at Berkeley University. Berkeley police were ordered to stand down by university officials, and we've witnessed this time and time again in other cities such as Baltimore, Charlottesville, and Seattle, and of course in Portland, where local elected officials actually take the side of protesters. Let's now turn our attention to the current rights and protests that started following the death of George Floyd. We know that all of these public displays of violence are greatly influenced by Black Lives Matter Antifa followers, along with paid outside agitators. Atlanta, Georgia is just one example of the carnage that the red-green axis is promoting. By now, the images of what took place in Atlanta on May 29th are all too familiar, and compared to other cities, they may even seem tame. Many police vehicles were destroyed. Even the home of the progressive media, CNN, was attacked. The violence continued for days. Even the Football College Hall of Fame was vandalized. During the riots in Atlanta, the chief of police issued a stand-down order on May 29th because she feared her officers were vastly outnumbered and some would be seriously injured, wounded, or killed. I, for one, support this decision because unlike at Berkeley, the police at least tried to intervene but could not. But I will never forget the public press conference that followed this stand-down order. On May 30th, the chief of police and Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms, seen behind her, held a joint press conference announcing a 9 p.m. curfew and a zero tolerance order for protesters. Unfortunately, we would soon learn the mayor had her fingers crossed when she uttered these words. But the chief of police did not. She was obviously upset that she had to stand down her officers previously and said now that I am now ready to put some people in jail. Well, it didn't take long before Mayor Bottoms showed her true understanding of zero tolerance. The curfew came at 9 p.m. and many protesters violated it. Two violators were college students in their car who refused to comply with police orders to exit their vehicle. Rather, they chose to barricade themselves inside the car. So officers, following their training, and used reasonable force to remove the two students, to include using their tasers to incapacitate them. Neither student was injured. Mayor Bottoms soon after fired all officers involved without due process. So much for zero tolerance. Unfortunately, this was not the only example where Atlanta's leadership failed to provide due process to their police officers. Several days later, another violator refused to comply with a police officer's orders. Rashard Brooks took the officer's taser, fled, and turned and fired at the police. Officer Garrett Rolfe gave chase, returned fire, killing Brooks. Almost immediately, Atlanta's district attorney, Paul Howard, charged Rolfe for murder. Without any due process, not waiting for the results from a GBI investigation, and without forming a grand jury to hear the evidence. In all fairness, local city elected officials face a major ethical dilemma in cases involving law enforcement use of force. Either sacrifice officers to spare more looting, arson, and violence, or provide due process to officers and risk almost certain violence in response. Added to this untenable situation is the movement to defund or eliminate police departments altogether. Demands made by Black Lives Matter and Antifa. For many law-abiding citizens, there remains but one answer. Let's return to Antifa. Remember, these are local, independent, autonomous groups, well-armed, trained, and violent. As reported on 2017, with little media coverage, Antifa individuals received jihadist training by ISIS and Al-Qaeda followers in the Middle East. Remember Marcuse's repressive tolerance? Total rejection of free speech except for them. And this is being taught at many colleges and universities. America's is illegitimate, founded by elite white men who use black slaves and others for their economic gain. Unlike Black Lives Matter groups, Antifa's riots and roots go back to the 1920s and 30s, when leftists opposed fascists in Spain, Italy, and Germany. Following World War II, the anti-fascist movement went dormant, only to be revived in 1999 during the anti-World Trade protests in Seattle and later during the Occupy Wall Street movement of 2011. Reported recently on August 7th, the Department of Homeland Security is now investigating Antifa's connections to Syrian jihadist terrorists and Kurdish factions. Nonetheless, the mainstream media claims that Antifa is a peaceful protest movement. Before closing, and to further underscore the Marxist Islamic Alliance, is a demonstration held on July 4th at Stone Mountain Park near Atlanta, Georgia, where participants were chanting, "Thanks be to Allah." This brings us to a close to part 2 of the Red-Green Axis, where we covered the origins of the Black Lives Matter movement and Antifa, and the profound influence of 60s and 70s radicals, many previously affiliated with the Weather Underground. During our final presentation, we'll explore some of the consequences of the Red-Green Alliance to our national security establishment, our local law enforcement, and to our neighborhoods. Until then, good day.